It's impossible to talk about Hurricane Rita without talking about the larger context of the 2005 hurricane season. We all know 2005 to be one of the most intense hurricane seasons on US record, but interestingly enough, the beginning of 2005, even for severe weather, started off eerily quiet. The tornado season, typically spanning from March to June in the United States, was really somewhat lackluster. And in the entire severe weather season for 2005, there was only one F4 tornado in the fall. But while the beginning of the year might have been quiet, the 2005 hurricane season was rife with some of the most intense and consequential hurricanes in American history.
The potential for loss of life.
But you know, that flood control system is designed to handle a Category 3 storm.
Got another squall coming in. Take a look. We're looking at the... I don't think this far inland. We're about 4 or 5...
And the 2005 hurricane season wasn't just intense, it was record-breaking, both for the sheer amount of hurricanes it produced and of course for holding the record for the most damaging and costly hurricane on record at the time, Hurricane Katrina. And that's where the story of Hurricane Rita really begins, in my opinion, with Hurricane Katrina. Not only did Hurricane Katrina impact similar regions in the Gulf of Mexico, it happened just a few weeks before Hurricane Rita's landfall, with over 1,300 fatalities and over $100 billion in damage. It's almost impossible to overstate the impact that Hurricane Katrina had in the Gulf of Mexico. And that goes for both physically, the amount of damage that was caused, the loss of life, the injuries, and also the psychological impact that Hurricane Katrina had on millions of residents in the Gulf. So it's in this context, fresh in the wake of Hurricane Katrina's wrath, that we begin the story of Hurricane Rita. September 7th, 2005. It's been just over a week since Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf Coast, and cleanup efforts are underway. Meanwhile, a tropical disturbance from an African easterly wave is beginning to form off the west coast of the continent. These disturbances happen frequently in the summer and fall months off the western coast of Africa and are largely responsible for a good portion of Atlantic hurricanes. And by all means, this tropical wave looked like one of many that would eventually die off over open water as it struggled to get any kind of momentum going. But that was about to change. In the next 24 hours, enough relaxation of vertical wind shear has allowed the storm to strengthen just over the Dominican Republic. Eventually, the National Hurricane Center takes notice, and weather reconnaissance planes fly over the storm. The NHC classifies the storm for the first time as a tropical depression, and it was now given a name: Rita. Beginning September 19th, tropical storm watches and warnings are now being issued for portions of the Bahamas, and while there was this uncertainty as to where Rita might track as it moves westward past the Bahamas, one thing was becoming increasingly apparent. Rita, continuing her westward track, was about to enter the abnormally warm waters ahead in the Gulf of Mexico, and rapid intensification of the storm was becoming more apparent. On the 19th of September, Cuba had already begun issuing advisories to residents to prepare for the storm. Ultimately, 150,000 were evacuated from portions of northern Cuba. In Florida, several mandatory evacuation orders were being placed for some 340,000 residents. By the morning of September 20th, 2005, Tropical Storm Rita is officially considered a Category 1 hurricane, with sustained winds of 74 miles per hour, with a 956 millibar low-pressure center.
The latest advisory from the National Hurricane Center. Again, this is the 2 o'clock advisory. Just came across the wire. It is 50 miles south of Key West. Now, that's the center of circulation. And look at the winds, 100 miles an hour.
Only 6 hours after gaining its first official Category 1 hurricane title, Hurricane Rita has intensified to a Category 2 hurricane just 45 miles south of Key West, Florida. It's now becoming more apparent that Hurricane Rita has essentially nothing to hinder it from becoming a major hurricane and will inevitably hit one of the already extremely vulnerable Gulf states.
All eyes are open, of course, here along the Gulf Coast, mainly the Texas Gulf Coast and the western coastal areas of Louisiana, because this is the projection. Now, we're expecting it to continue moving due west for a time, and then as we approach the weekend, it could veer to the north, and that's when we think it will get closer to the coast of Texas.
On late September 20th and into the 21st, Rita is rapidly intensifying in the Gulf of Mexico, and officials are preparing for the very real possibility of being hit yet again by another major hurricane just after Katrina's devastation. Of the states who had the most to worry about, of course, was Louisiana. In light of Rita looming in the Gulf, President George W. Bush quickly issues a state of emergency for both Louisiana and Florida to allow for federal funding to be brought in. Officials in Galveston, Texas, start to issue a series of voluntary and mandatory evacuations that are being established for areas in the surge zones along the coast. The city of Houston, Texas also issues a mandatory evacuation of the city's public shelters that were already housing victims from Hurricane Katrina. So you can imagine being a survivor of Hurricane Katrina, you're already having to be evacuated to Houston, which is really far away, and a lot of these people were then evacuated again to Arkansas. And this is part of the critical context here. The people who live on the Gulf in this case, whether or not they were impacted by Hurricane Katrina in the weeks prior, particularly on the Texas coast, they're now essentially thinking that another Hurricane Katrina could be happening to them with Hurricane Rita, and so you can understand why that might make people quite fearful, and this is something we're going to talk about a lot. Within hours, Rita is at Category 3 intensity, and essentially when you have a hurricane like this in the open waters of the Gulf of Mexico with no wind shear to affect it, meteorologists know that there's nothing stopping it from becoming a major hurricane, and that is exactly what Rita was about to do. Within just a few hours of getting its Category 3 title, Rita strengthens into a Category 4 major hurricane, and shortly after, at 10 p.m. on September 21st, 2005, Hurricane Rita becomes a Category 5 hurricane with sustained winds of 170 miles per hour. In the past 24 hours, Rita has gone from a Category 3 to a Category 5 powerhouse storm in the Gulf of Mexico. Along with the overnight intensification, the National Hurricane Center is expecting a shift in the forecast track for Hurricane Rita. It's now headed directly towards the southeastern coast of Texas and the majority of western Louisiana. This solidification of Major Hurricane Rita's path prompts immediate evacuation orders for any of the remaining areas in the Texas Golden Triangle into portions of southwestern Louisiana that hadn't already been evacuated. The pressure for residents to evacuate and the sense of urgency for them to do so continues to build. And it's at this point that we're going to start discussing the evacuation process of Hurricane Rita, as it's about to take a turn for the worst. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina and the psychological response that people had to it, many at this point, thousands, have already chosen to voluntarily evacuate both in southeastern Texas and in Louisiana. But now, with new mandatory evacuation orders coming and the public pressure from officials in major cities, particularly in Texas, the traffic is about to go from bad to much, much worse.
But quite frankly, the Katrina factor weighs heavily here. And by that, government officials are telling us, look, we are issuing this evacuation order now, and the fact is that because we had Katrina a few weeks ago, that is actually helping us. More people are actually listening to us because of what happened in Louisiana. And by the way, Jennifer and Carl, a number of people didn't really wait for that deadline at 6 p.m. Central. They were long gone hours before. The freeways out of here were absolutely jammed much of the day.
In order to mitigate some of this anticipated buildup, the state of Texas begins to implement their hurricane evacuation plans by staggering the evacuations in order to reduce some of the intense buildup that they are already anticipating. Now, it's important to note before we get too deep into the evacuation disaster conversation that not every area was a disaster in terms of the evacuation process. There were plenty of areas that evacuated efficiently and well, particularly in Louisiana. The areas that we're largely going to be discussing today are in southeastern Texas. By September 22nd and going into September 23rd, the traffic and evacuation process are getting more and more chaotic by the minute. On Wednesday, Houston's Mayor Bill White urged residents to evacuate the city, telling residents, quote, "Don't wait, the time to wait is over," along with reminding residents of the disaster that just unfolded in New Orleans.
The exodus from Galveston, Texas started at sunrise.
Coastal Texans should not wait until late Thursday or early Friday to leave.
You are here, and it's at your risk that you stay here.
Many boarded up homes and businesses before leaving town. Thousands took advantage of emergency bus service and departed to shelters throughout the state. Residents like Dana Little are bound for Huntsville, Texas, about 2 hours inland.
We're going to be evacuees, not refugees.
Government officials here say the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina convinced many people to leave.
We don't want to go through what they went through in New Orleans. I feel for those people.
And while I do think that some of this was warranted, and I don't think that the mayor had any ill intentions, I think that making these kinds of statements only really further served to promote panic. The way that Texas specifically implemented these evacuation orders were that those who were leaving were on a predetermined route to various cities across Texas to try to disperse the traffic and the amount of supplies and the hotels that were available. That was the intention. But now, not only is the traffic becoming gridlocked in Texas, temperatures are now beginning to rise under a heat wave.
Long lines of evacuation traffic jam freeways throughout southeast Texas. The storm is expected to disrupt water and power service.
Unfortunately, Betty and Mark, the temperatures today, we are going to be near records, if not breaking records, in the mid to upper 90s. We're typically in the mid to upper 80s, so we are going to be well above average, and that is going to cause a lot of exhaustion, heat exhaustion. People need to make sure they prepare for that as well.
Local areas on these predetermined routes are running out of gas, they're running out of food, and they're running out of water and supplies for the travelers on these evacuation routes. As the situation is unfolding, Mayor White, who once encouraged everyone to get out as soon as possible, now says, quote, "If you're not in the evacuation zone, follow the news," advising people to use their common sense. We'll let that sink in for a minute. By 3 p.m. on September 22nd, in the Texas heatwave, the Houston freeway system was at a standstill, which was about to become the common theme for many of the Texas roadways. Now, of course, there's a lot more context to this. The traffic was moving much slower than the Texas officials had anticipated, much slower than the typical evacuation for a hurricane that they've ever experienced. People were really scared after Hurricane Katrina, and the amount of people who were voluntarily evacuating was simply unprecedented. To try to help some of the gridlock in the most intense areas, the Texas Department of Transportation implemented a contraflow lane reversal on Interstate 45 northbound, moving towards Dallas, and on Interstate 10 moving westward towards San Antonio and Austin, Texas. But at this point, with hundreds of thousands of people having evacuated in southeastern Texas alone, the contraflow simply wasn't enough. A situation where in a Texas heatwave, tens of thousands of people were stuck in gridlock traffic, running out of gas, running out of food, and running out of water as temperatures rose to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Many evacuees periodically would turn off their air condition in an attempt to reduce fuel consumption, and rationed their water and food portions, but for dozens, it would already be too late. By the end of the 24 to 36 hour horrific traffic jam, over 100 people lost their life in the gridlock traffic. These people lost their life in the evacuation process, largely due to heat exhaustion, dehydration, cardiac events, and other medical emergencies that weren't able to be helped because there was no medical assistance in the area. To put a little more context into that fatality count, through the entirety of Hurricane Rita in the state of Texas specifically, Texas reported 113 total fatalities from Rita, 107 of which were related to the evacuation process. September 23, 2005, less than 24 hours before Hurricane Rita's landfall. With contraflow having been implemented in the Texas roadways, traffic was very slowly, but eventually starting to lessen. Officials are now not only dealing with the preparation for the hurricane's landfall, but they're also dealing with the fallout of the evacuation tragedy and trying to grasp the full scope of what's just happened on the roadways. It's also in the final 24 hours before Hurricane Rita makes landfall that the National Hurricane Center has another adjustment in the forecasted trajectory of Rita's landfall, and as it turned out, tens of thousands of those people who had just endured the Texas traffic nightmare didn't actually need to leave at all, and they were essentially safe from the hurricane. And they just went through that traumatizing experience and didn't really need to at all. And this wasn't a small percentage of those people either. One study found that some 2/3 of the evacuees in the state of Texas didn't need to evacuate at all. In total, an estimated 2.5 to 3 million people had evacuated on these predetermined evacuation routes or otherwise fled from Hurricane Rita. In the final 12 hours before Hurricane Rita's landfall in the Gulf Coast, it's too late to leave at this point. People have either gone or they have to hunker down with their supplies. They've boarded up their homes, but it's this really eerie and ominous mood that kind of sits, and it really is the calm before the storm. Everyone's just kind of waiting for the landfall to happen. And thankfully, just before it makes landfall, Hurricane Rita actually begins to weaken. For the past day, Rita had maintained Category 5 intensity before undergoing an eye wall replacement cycle that weakened it down to a Category 4 and ultimately down to a Category 3 by the time it makes landfall. By nightfall, the outer bands of Hurricane Rita begin to creep onto the shores. At 2:40 a.m. on September 24th, 2005, Hurricane Rita makes landfall between Sabine Pass and the Johnson Bayou, Louisiana, just east of the Louisiana-Texas border, with sustained winds of 115 miles per hour. As Hurricane Rita made landfall, the state of Louisiana experienced what is called the dirty side of the hurricane, or the eastern half. This is an expression that's used to convey the fact that the eastern or right quadrant of the hurricane experiences the most intense wind impacts. In Louisiana, Rita's storm surge inundated communities along the coast, particularly ones that were low-lying, and in some cases, ones that had already been somewhat devastated by Hurricane Katrina. Recently repaired levees from Hurricane Katrina were once again toppled over in Category 2 winds in New Orleans. Parishes in southwestern Louisiana on the dirty side of the storm also saw some of the most intense wind damage. Cameron Parish saw catastrophic flooding along the coastline and intracoastal waterway, where the storm surge exceeded 17 feet in the communities of Cameron, Creole, Holly Beach, and Oak Grove, which were heavily battered in the winds. There were multiple other areas that saw really intense wind damage just outside of the eye wall. The community of Hackberry had an unofficial wind gust of 180 miles per hour, which, as you all know, is pretty much violent tornado intensity wind gust happening. In southeastern Louisiana, the Terrebonne Parish experienced a storm surge of over 7 feet, flooding over 10,000 homes and leveling almost every levee. Nearly 100 people were rescued there via helicopter and boat. In Vermilion Parish, which is in central Louisiana, the storm surge was 10 feet, destroying nearly all the structures on Pecan Island, with some 1,000 people stranded due to flooding and over 250 needing to be rescued. In total, 5 Louisiana parishes would be declared disaster zones in the wake of Hurricane Rita. Ultimately, Louisiana saw an additional $8 billion of damage from Hurricane Rita, and very tragically, at least one person was known to have drowned from Hurricane Rita in Louisiana. Texas largely experienced the western side of Hurricane Rita, and although the western side is typically considered the weaker side, it is also more prevalent for the storm surge. Ultimately, the storm surge that was expected in Galveston and Houston and portions along the Texas coast struck further east towards Louisiana, but Texas did still endure some damage. One of the silver linings for Texas specifically was that the winds blowing offshore in the state of Texas actually flattened out the storm surge, which was anticipated to be worse on the western side. The storm surge was actually only 7 feet in Galveston. Sabine Pass did experience the brunt of the storm surge as Rita moved into Texas, and as a result, much of the community was destroyed. According to a disaster center report, a total of 14,256 additional single-family dwellings had major damage, and another 26,211 single-family dwellings received minor damage in the state of Texas. Ultimately, 9 Texas counties were declared disaster zones, and some 2 million people lost power, many of which went without it for weeks. Total damage in the state of Texas was estimated to be $18.5 billion. By September 25th and into the 26th, of course, Rita, as it moves overland, is rapidly weakening. And by 7 p.m. on the same day as landfall, all tropical cyclone warnings and watches were discontinued as Hurricane Rita disintegrated into a large area of low pressure over the Mississippi Valley. Now, this would not be my channel unless I very briefly talked about tornadoes in some way, shape, or form. So I'm going to quickly mention the tornadoes spawned from Hurricane Rita in the Mississippi Valley. There are usually 2 times when a tornado threat is pretty relevant with a hurricane. The first being the quick spin-up tornadoes that happen in the outer bands. As we mentioned, that primarily happens on the dirty side of the storm, although not always. And the second time the tornado threat is relevant is in the subsequent days after. A lot of times in the remnants of the system, the thermodynamics and the kinematics really come together and can cause somewhat of an elevated tornado threat. Hurricane Rita spawned an impressive 98 confirmed tornadoes in the remnants and caused 1 known fatality. In total, the damage from Hurricane Rita was just under $20 billion. As a result of the disaster declaration in Texas by Governor Perry, many residents who were displaced or trying to return in the aftermath of Hurricane Rita had the ability to use up to 60 days of covered hotel rooms, generators, and monetary assistance by FEMA. And again, this is where President George W. Bush opening up the federal funding for the states of Florida and Louisiana really helped and came into play.
The country and the world has seen the great compassion of the Texas people after Hurricane Katrina. Over 300,000 people moved east to west, and they found home here in Texas. We're now dealing with another storm, and the state of Texas is prepared for and is now responding to a storm that's affecting East Texas. I'm briefed day up in Colorado about the federal government's response to the storm. Then went to Austin to be briefed by the state officials. And then tomorrow morning, General Clark's going to come over and brief me once again about how the federal government is helping the state of Texas and Louisiana recover.
On September 24th, the same day that Hurricane Rita made landfall, the National Guard was deployed into Louisiana in the hardest hit areas. This included 1,400 soldiers and airmen, the 1st Battalion of the 186th Infantry, which is a quick response unit. Engineers and military police from Louisiana also joined in to provide rapid relief for those hardest hit in Louisiana and southeastern Texas. The American Red Cross was also quickly available. They had largely already been in Louisiana from Hurricane Katrina. In the next coming days, of course, there was a large search and rescue operation that was conducted to make sure that there was nobody else who was missing or unaccounted for. And by the time that process was over, the official death toll from Hurricane Rita, both from the storm itself, the evacuation process, and the cleanup efforts afterwards, totaled to 120 lives. Now we're going to switch to talking a little bit more about the after effects of the fatalities that occurred during the evacuation and a little bit of controversy that ensued as well. There is an incredible publication done on the sociological analysis and impact of Hurricane Rita's evacuation done. I'll have that linked below, but I want to talk about a few of the points from that publication. It writes, quote, "When the need to evacuate becomes necessary, emergency managers faced with the task of convincing the appropriate people to flee must also cope with the people's tendencies to respond to such a warning with disbelief rather than action." So these emergency managers are put in a really difficult situation where they have to convince someone to leave their home and to be stuck in traffic and to go somewhere hundreds of miles away sometimes. And that's a really difficult spot to be put in, and also trying to convince the people that this is really going to come to fruition. However, for Hurricane Rita, the opposite seemed to be true, as there appeared to be a significant shadow evacuation, a phenomenon that occurs when people believe they are at risk even though they've not been officially advised, and the result of that, 48% approximately of the population of Harris County in Texas, an area that was not considered to be an evacuation zone for any hurricane, choosing to evacuate. Evacuation models for Harris County suggested that between 800,000 and 1.2 million people would flee from the Houston area, yet for Hurricane Rita, approximately 2.5 million people chose to evacuate, leading to the colossal 100-mile-long traffic jams that led many people to be stranded, out of gas, and ultimately lose their lives. So how was all of this addressed? How were the fatalities addressed, and what were the plans to change things moving forward, particularly in Texas? Weeks after the fallout of the evacuation tragedy, Texas Governor Rick Perry established a task force to assess what went wrong. By February of 2006, 5 months after Hurricane Rita's impact, the group had published their findings and made several recommendations on how to improve moving forward. The improvements included bettering public-private partnerships to provide adequate provisions like fuel and medical personnel along paths for when they do get backed up or overflowed at the worst traffic points. The plan that this task force came up with was essentially to place food, water, ice, and restrooms and medical assistance along the routes for the next time that an evacuation like this would come into play. And that was what they recommended. And I find that really anticlimactic. To me, this seems more of a tactic that aims to put water on the fire after it's already started, rather than to try to prevent the fire in the first place from happening. I could be totally wrong on this. This is just my personal opinion. I think they could have maybe included some strategies to prevent gridlock traffic like that from happening in the first place. Maybe that's just me. I also want to note that outside of the main impacts of Hurricane Rita with the devastation and fatalities, the implications were a lot further than I initially anticipated. It's since been speculated, even by the director of the National Hurricane Center, Bill Reed, that the fallout of the Rita evacuation was so negative and such a disaster that he believes it was the reason that a lot of people have since chosen to stay in their area and not listen to mandatory evacuation orders for other hurricanes like Hurricane Ike, which occurred 3 years later. The people who went through that evacuation with Rita, or other people who even just heard about that story, went through so much trauma and so much stress that I don't think anyone can really blame those residents if they chose to not really want to evacuate again, or if they didn't really believe that they needed to evacuate again. What I will say though is that in the almost 20 years since Hurricane Rita's destruction in the Gulf Coast, there are some communities in the Intracoastal Waterway that are still recovering with their populations, which are significantly lower than the previous population before the 2005 hurricane season. Looking at the legacy of Hurricane Rita almost 20 years later, outside of the really intense implications of the evacuation tragedy, Hurricane Rita is still the fourth strongest hurricane in the Atlantic in terms of barometric pressure. And as a result of the destruction that Rita caused in the Gulf Coast, the name was retired in the spring of 2006 and will never again be used for an Atlantic hurricane. I think for me, one of the biggest takeaways from the story of Hurricane Rita is that we can never ever underestimate the psychological impact that these natural disasters, hurricanes or tornadoes or whatever else, can have on human beings, and how much that influences our decisions moving forward. Each person's individual experience directly influences the amount of stimuli they might need to respond to a tornado warning, for example, or hurricane watch or warning or evacuation. And these are really important things for us to consider, especially in the weather community, because they have such a big influence on how we behave and how we perceive these threats. I think once we have a better understanding of individuals' perceptions of danger, particularly when it comes to weather, we can maybe better understand the warning process and how we might improve it moving forward for future generations. It is such a tragedy that we had to lose over 100 lives in an evacuation failure from Hurricane Rita to try to have some catalyst for a change in the way that evacuations are seen and done. My only hope is that something like this will never ever happen again, and I hope by talking about it even just a little bit that some of you might take future warnings a little bit more seriously. It's always better to be safe and to be prepared than to find out the hard way. That's the note I'm going to leave off on today. I really hope I did a little bit of justice to the story of Hurricane Rita, and I hope that the hurricane coverage was okay for you all. Please let me know what you thought about it in the comments, and if you really liked it, then you can leave a like on my video. That does help me in the algorithm, or subscribe if you aren't already. Again, you can find me and Tornado Pagey on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. And yeah, that's all I have for you all today. Just thank you so much for being here. Thank you for taking the time out of your day, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.